The frost clung to the cabin windows like a secret refusing to let go, crystallizing in jagged patterns that blurred the world outside into a haze of white and gray. Jasper Kane's breath plumed in the frigid morning air as he swung the axe down with a force that reverberated up his spine, splitting another log into kindling. The rhythm of the work was deliberate, almost punishing, each strike a futile attempt to drown the ghosts that haunted him. His hands, chapped and raw from the cold, trembled slightly, not from the effort but from the weight of the silence that had settled over the cabin for 6 long months. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, thick with the memory of his wife's laughter, the scent of lavender soap lingering in the folds of her shawl, still draped over the armchair where she'd last left it. He hadn't moved it, couldn't. To do so would be to admit she was truly gone, that the ache in his chest wasn't just a temporary wound but a permanent hollow. As the sun clawed its way above the horizon, casting pale gold light over the snow-dusted prairie, Jasper paused, leaning on the axe handle. The cattle in the west field had been restless all week, their lowing carried on the wind like a warning. He'd come to check the fence line, his rifle slung over his back not out of expectation, but habit. A man couldn't afford to be unprepared in a land where trouble had a knack for arriving uninvited. It was near the willow break, where the creek cut a shallow path through the frozen earth, that he saw them. At first, he mistook the shapes for debris, a bundle of rags snagged on the barbed wire, perhaps, or the carcass of some unfortunate animal. But as he drew closer, the forms resolved into something unmistakably human. 2 figures, huddled so tightly they seemed fused, their breath rising in faint silver clouds that vanished before reaching the sky. The woman's face was a mosaic of bruises, her cheekbone darkened, her lips split and parched. Her skin, the color of rich earth after rain, was stark against the snow, and her tangled hair framed her face like a storm cloud. She cradled the child in her arms with a desperation that made Jasper's throat tighten. A girl no older than 8, her small frame skeletal beneath a thin, torn dress. Her feet were bare, blue-tinged, and her eyes, wide, black as coal, locked onto Jasper's with a stillness that unnerved him. They weren't pleading. Not exactly. They were watching, as if measuring whether he was a threat or a savior. Jasper dismounted slowly, his boots crunching in the frost-stiff grass. The woman didn't flinch, but her grip on the girl tightened, her swollen belly pressing against the tattered fabric of her coat. Pregnant. The realization hit him like a blow. What kind of danger could drive a woman in her condition to this godforsaken place? His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to ride for help, or better yet, to leave them to whatever fate had brought them here. He knew what folks would say about finding a Navajo woman on his land, injured and uninvited. Knew the rumors that would follow, the questions he'd have to answer. But then the girl blinked, once, twice, and something in her gaze pierced him. Not fear, not hope, but a quiet, unyielding awareness, as if she'd already calculated the odds of survival and decided he was worth the risk. He reached for his canteen, offering it first to the woman. Her fingers, trembling but purposeful, closed around it. Water spilled down her chin as she drank, then tipped the canteen to the girl's lips. The child swallowed, her color returning faintly, and when she looked at him again, Jasper swore he saw the ghost of a smile, a flicker of pink in her lips, fragile as the first thaw. He stood abruptly, the weight of the rifle on his back suddenly unbearable. He could leave them here. Hell, he should. But the girl's eyes followed him, wide and unblinking, and in their depths he saw a reflection of himself. The man he'd been after his wife died, hollow and adrift, clinging to survival because he couldn't face the alternative. "Come on," he muttered, the words barely audible over the wind. He didn't expect them to move. But the woman nodded, her movements slow and deliberate as she tried to rise, her legs buckling under her. Without thinking, Jasper stepped forward, his hands brushing hers as he lifted the girl into his arm. She didn't resist, her body stiff but not unyielding, her gaze never leaving his face. Together, they mounted the horse, three souls and one weary, gelding, breathing steam into the cold. The ride back to the cabin was silent. The only sounds the crunch of hooves on frozen ground and the occasional whimper from the girl as she pressed her face into Jasper's coat. When they arrived, he stoked the fire until the cabin hummed with warmth, laying out blankets near the hearth. The woman eased down onto the rug, her swollen belly a stark reminder of the life she carried. Too far along to be traveling, Jasper thought, his jaw tightening. Too far along to be fleeing whatever had brought her here. He asked for names, but the answers came like whispers. Sani, the woman said, and Alma for the girl. No explanations, no thanks. Just the quiet exchange of syllables that felt like the first thread in a tapestry he didn't yet understand. As night fell, Jasper sat outside on the porch, the stars above cold and indifferent. He smoked a pipe he didn't care for, the tobacco bitter on his tongue, and stared at the horizon. Who were they? Why had they been left to die in the snow? And why, when he looked at Alma's wide eyes, did he feel like he'd already failed her? The wind howled low, carrying the scent of pine and distant smoke, and Jasper tightened his coat against the chill. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. He didn't know what he'd just invited into his life, but he knew one thing. Saving them felt less like an act of mercy and more like stepping into a storm he couldn't outrun. The cabin creaked like an old ship adrift in a stormless sea, its wooden bones settling into a rhythm that felt both foreign and inevitable. Sani and Alma slept near the hearth, their bodies curled inward as if still shielding themselves from some invisible cold. The firelight flickered over them, casting shadows that danced across the walls like spectral storytellers. Sani's face, once taut with exhaustion, had softened in sleep, though her hand never left the curve of her belly, a silent vow to the life still growing within her. Alma's breath puffed in shallow bursts. Her small fingers clenched around a corner of the patched dress Jasper had left by the door that morning. He'd taken it from his wife's closet, the fabric faded but soft, its faded embroidery a relic of a life he'd buried 6 months ago. By dusk, the dress was gone, replaced by the faintest trace of lavender soap lingering in the air, a scent he hadn't noticed since his wife's shawl had last moved in the chair. Jasper sat at the kitchen table, the fire's glow barely reaching the hollows of his face. His hands trembled slightly as he poured broth into a chipped bowl, steam rising in thin spirals that blurred the room's edges. He didn't call out when Sani stirred, her eyes fluttering open to find him watching. She didn't thank him when he slid the bowl toward her, but her nod carried the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. Alma woke soon after, silent as ever, her dark eyes fixed on Jasper as she ate, her movements precise and deliberate, as though every bite was a lesson in survival. The cabin filled with the sound of spoons scraping porcelain, the crackle of burning logs, and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath Sani's careful steps as she paced to soothe the child within her. When they returned to the hearth, Jasper retreated to the porch, the chill of the night air sharp against his skin. The stars above were cold and distant, their light indifferent to the turmoil simmering in his chest. He lit his pipe, though the tobacco tasted bitter, and let the silence stretch around him like a second skin. Memories clawed at the edges of his mind, his wife's humming as she stirred pots, the way her braided hair fell over her shoulder when she'd bent to tend the garden, the warmth of her laughter that once filled the cabin until it felt alive. Now, that warmth had been replaced by the quiet resilience of strangers. Sani's voice, when she spoke at all, was like wind through reeds, low, steady, unyielding. And Alma's stare, though silent, carried the weight of a child who had already learned to measure the world in threats and survival. Back inside, He retrieved his wife's journal from a shelf, its leather cover worn smooth by time. The pages smelled faintly of lavender, a scent that now felt like an echo of a life he could barely remember. His pen hovered over the paper, trembling slightly before he pressed it down. Sani, he wrote first, the name flowing like water finding its course. Then Alma, hesitating only briefly before adding Nodin. The question mark after the final name felt like a warning etched into his bones, a reminder that this fragile trio could unravel as quickly as it had formed. He closed the journal without another word, the weight of the names pressing down on him like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. As dawn approached, Jasper stood at the edge of the porch, staring into the horizon where the land met the sky. The frost had returned, clinging to the grass like a secret he couldn't yet decipher. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, its cry sharp and lonely. He thought of the rifle by the door, the traps he'd laid near the creek, the way Sani's gaze often drifted eastward, as if waiting for the past to catch up. For now, the cabin held its breath, suspended between grief and something unnamed, a fragile, flickering thing that might, if nurtured, grow into hope. But Jasper knew better than to trust stillness. Trouble had a way of finding him, and the question mark lingered, heavy and unresolved, in the quiet spaces between them. Days bled into a rhythm neither asked for, but both clung to, as if the very act of moving forward might stitch the fractured pieces of their lives into something whole. Sani's hands, once trembling with exhaustion, now moved with purpose, mending shirts with thread salvaged from her own patched dress, feeding chickens with a practiced flick of grain from her palms. She wove scraps of fabric into intricate patterns, remnants of Jasper's wife's faded dresses and his own weathered work shirts transformed into tapestries that hung like whispered prayers on the cabin walls. Each stitch seemed to hum with stories she never voiced, of her people, her lost husband, the child she carried, but Jasper saw them anyway, etched into the angles of her designs, the colors speaking where words failed. Alma followed Jasper like a shadow, her small steps mirroring his as they moved through the rhythms of survival. She learned to oil saddles with a precision that belied her years, her fingers working the leather until it gleamed like whetstone. She hammered nails into fence posts with a focus that made Jasper's chest ache, her strikes sharp and deliberate, as though each one drove back the ghosts that clung to her. She read the land with a quiet intensity, noting animal tracks in the thawing mud, the way birds scattered at the scent of rain, the subtle shifts in wind that hinted at storms. She spoke little, but her eyes, dark, unblinking, alive, said everything. One morning, Jasper found a drawing tacked to the wall above the hearth, its edges curling like birch bark. Alma had sketched it in charcoal, her strokes bold yet tender. Herself with a feather tucked behind her ear, her mother's belly round and luminous beneath a sky of smudged stars, and Jasper, tall, broad-shouldered, almost mythic, standing under a tree that didn't exist, its branches stretching toward a horizon that seemed to breathe. The child had drawn them not as strangers thrust together by circumstance, but as a constellation bound by something older than blood. Jasper lingered over it, his throat tightening around the unspoken truth that this was no longer just a cabin, no longer just survival. It was a portrait of what they'd become, fragile and defiant. He didn't speak of it aloud, but when Sani hummed a lullaby later that evening, her voice low and resonant as she rocked Nodin to sleep, he felt the weight of loneliness lift like fog burned away by sunlight. The melody was unfamiliar, its cadence Navajo, but it carried a sorrow and sweetness that seeped into the cracks of the cabin, softening the edges of his grief. For the first time in months, the space where his wife's laughter had once lived didn't feel like a wound. It felt like a vessel, slowly filling with something new. Yet, beneath the quiet harmony of their days, the undercurrent of danger never fully receded. Sani's gaze often drifted eastward, southward, toward the ridgelines where the land folded into shadows. She watched the horizon as though the wind might carry the sound of hoofbeats, her hand resting on her belly in a gesture that was both shield and solace. She never flinched when Jasper sharpened his knives or checked his rifle, her expression unreadable as he ran his thumb along the blade's edge or tested the weight of his revolver. Instead, she simply watched, her stillness unnerving in its calm. It wasn't resignation. It was calculation, the patience of someone who had already faced the worst and resolved to meet it head on. When Jasper caught her staring at the road beyond the pasture, her jaw would tighten, her fingers curling into fists before she smoothed them again, as if tucking her fears into hidden pockets. She waited, not with dread, but with the quiet resolve of a woman who knew the past would come knocking. And when it did, she would be ready. Amma, too, seemed to sense the unseen threads pulling taut around them. She began sleeping with a small knife tucked beneath her pillow, its handle wrapped in cloth so it wouldn't cut her as she turned her sleep. She lingered near the barn, memorizing the layout of every trap Jasper had set, her eyes lingering on the rifle he kept propped by the door. Yet, for all the tension woven into their days, there were moments of light so pure they seemed to defy the weight of what loomed. Alma's laughter, sudden and bright, as she chased a butterfly through the garden. The way Sani's voice softened when she sang to Nodin, her songs a bridge between worlds. Jasper, watching them, felt the ache of impermanence, a knowledge that this fragile piece could shatter like ice underfoot. But for now, they moved together in the rhythm they'd forged, three souls bound by silence, survival, and the unspoken promise that they would face whatever came next as one. The truth came like a crack in ice, sharp and sudden, splitting the fragile peace that had settled over the cabin. Sani sat cross-legged near the hearth, her hands resting on the curve of her belly as if anchoring the life within. The firelight flickered across her face, etching deep shadows into the hollows beneath her eyes. And when she spoke, her voice thinned into something brittle, like wind scraping over frozen ground. "They took us," she began, the words slow and deliberate, as though each one carried the weight of the snowdrifts outside. "My husband's camp. White men. Drunk. Angry." She paused, her fingers curling into the fabric of her dress, knuckles whitening. "He fought. Died quick. The rest." Her voice dissolved then, unraveling in his silence, the unspoken horrors hanging in the air like smoke. Jasper swallowed hard, his throat tight around the bitterness rising there. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, but outside, the wind howled, a keening wail that seemed to echo Alma's whimper from the corner where she slept curled beneath a patchwork quilt. The girl's face twisted in her dreams, her small hands clutching at the blanket as if fending off invisible hands. Sani turned toward her, her gaze softening with a mother's instinctive urgency, and murmured something in Navajo, low and rhythmic. The syllables spilled like water over stone, a lullaby steeped in ancient solace. Alma's breathing steadied, her brow smoothing, though her lips trembled as if holding onto the edges of a nightmare. Jasper's jaw tightened, his teeth grinding against the helplessness clawing at his chest. He thought of the rifle propped by the door, the ammunition stored in the cellar beneath the floorboards, the traps he'd laid along the perimeter of the land. He'd never stopped cleaning the rifle, not since his wife died, not since the world had taught him that safety was an illusion. Now those preparations felt less like paranoia and more like necessity. "I won't send you away," he said, the words rougher than he intended, as though they'd scraped through the raw edges of his resolve. Sani blinked once, slowly, her expression unreadable. That was all. No thanks, no questions. Just the quiet acceptance of someone who had long since stopped expecting kindness. Later that night, after Alma had fallen into a deeper sleep and Jasper had retreated to the porch to smoke a pipe he didn't care for. Sonny worked by the fire. She pulled strips of dyed fabric from a basket Jasper hadn't noticed before, along with twine and dried straw salvaged from the chicken's bedding. Her hands moved with a purpose that bordered on sacred, weaving the materials into a tapestry that seemed to grow beneath her fingers like a living thing. The patterns emerged slowly, swirls of ochre and indigo, jagged lines of crimson, a central motif of interlocking circles that radiated outward like ripples in still water. When she finished, she rose without a word and tacked it above the hearth, the flames casting shifting shadows across its surface. Alma woke just as her mother stepped back, her dark eyes widening as she took in the tapestry. For a moment, she said nothing, her small fingers brushing the hem of the fabric as if testing its reality. Then she whispered the word Jasper didn't know, an ill-finny eye. The syllables hung in Sutton, soft yet resonant, and Sonny smiled, a fleeting, tender thing as she knelt beside her daughter. Safe, she translated, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. Jasper, still standing in the doorway, felt the words settle into his bones, heavy and fragile all at once. Safe, a promise, a plea, a fragile shield against the storm gathering on the horizon. Outside, the wind screamed again, rattling the shutters, but inside, the cabin held its breath. Sonny returned to her seat, her hands folding neatly in her lap, and stared into the flames. Jasper watched her, noting the way her shoulders sagged ever so slightly, as though the act of speaking had drained her of some vital force. He wanted to ask more, to press for details about the men, the camp, the scars hidden beneath her calm exterior, but he held back. Questions could wait. For now, there was only this, the fire, the child, the woman who had survived too much, and the tapestry that seemed to hum with the weight of all they had endured. When Jasper finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost reverent. What does it mean? He gestured toward the woven circles, their patterns dizzying in their complexity. Sonny didn't look at him immediately. Instead, she reached out, brushing her fingertips over the tapestry as if tracing a map only she could see. It's a story, she said at last, of where we've been and where we're going. Her hand lingered on the central motif, the interlocking circles, before she withdrew it. It's a prayer, too, for the child, for us. Jasper nodded, though he didn't fully understand. He didn't need to. The meaning was in the act itself, in the way Sonny's hands had moved with such precision, in the way Alma now traced the patterns with her own small fingers, in the way the firelight seemed to dance differently across the woven threads. It was a declaration of a defiance against the chaos that had brought them here. That night, as Jasper lay awake in his bed, he replayed the word Alma had spoken, safe. It echoed in his mind like a lullaby of his own, a sound both foreign and familiar. He thought of the barn door he'd reinforced that afternoon, the rifle shells he'd polished until they gleamed, the way Sonny's gaze often drifted toward the east, where the hills met the sky. Danger was coming. He could feel it in the marrow of his bones. But for now, there was this fragile, flickering thing they'd built together. A hearth, a tapestry, a word whispered in the dark. And in the quiet hours before dawn, as the wind finally began to die down, Jasper whispered it back to himself, shaping his lips around the unfamiliar syllables until they felt like a vow. Safe. Spring thawed the land in fits and starts, the earth softening beneath a sky that couldn't decide whether to weep or shine. Snowmelt pooled in the lowlands, turning paths to muck, while the creek swelled and roared, carrying branches and debris downstream like broken promises. The air hung thick with the scent of damp soil and the metallic tang of impending rain, but the tension coiled in Sonny's shoulders never eased. She hummed more often now, a low, resonant melody that seemed to rise from her bones. But her fingers never stilled over the dough she kneaded, the rhythm sharp and deliberate, as though each fold was a stitch to hold the world together. Her eyes, dark and unblinking, drifted eastward at dusk, southward at dawn, scanning the horizon where the hills met the sky like a seam ready to split. She never flinched when Jasper sharpened his knives or checked the rifle, but her gaze lingered on the blade's edge, the gun's polished barrel, as if measuring their weight against the ghost she carried. One evening, as the sun bled orange over the pasture, Jasper found her by the corral, her hand resting on the weathered fence, the other cradling her belly like a promise. The horses moved restlessly behind her, their coats glistening with sweat, tails flicking against the chill. Sonny didn't turn as he approached, but her voice came steady, almost serene. "He'll come early." The words hung in the air, soft yet unyielding. Jasper leaned against the post, his boots sinking slightly into the mud. "How do you know?" he asked, though he already felt the answer in the tightness of her posture, the way her breath hitched when the wind shifted. "My body knows," she replied, her palm pressing firmer against the curve of her abdomen, as if the child within might answer. He didn't ask about the children she'd lost before. The silence between them had grown roots too deep to disturb. Instead, he watched her profile, the way her jaw set against some unseen storm, the way her fingers curled around the fence like she might anchor herself to the land itself. Then came the rider. He appeared at twilight, a silhouette against the fading light, his horse moving with the weary arrogance of a man who'd ridden far and cared little who saw him. Jasper stood on the porch, rifle in hand, the wood grain slick with condensation beneath his grip. The stranger's saddle bore a brand, a snake coiled tight, its fangs bared in leather, a mark Jasper recognized from whispers in saloons, and the scar on a dead man's chest he'd once buried. The rider didn't stop, didn't wave, just tipped his hat as he passed, the gesture too deliberate, too slow. Jasper's throat tightened. He waited until the figure vanished beyond the ridge before stepping inside, bolting the door with a finality that made Alma glance up from her doll, her braiding fingers still. Sonny stirred the pot, the scent of stew thick with sage and onion, but her shoulders tensed at the sound of the lock. Nodin, swaddled in a blanket by the hearth, cooed softly, oblivious. They didn't ask what he'd seen, not aloud, but when Sonny looked up, her fear, the kind that haunted dreams, had been replaced by something sharper, resolve. Her eyes, once shadowed by survival, now burned with a quiet fire, her lips pressed into a thin line as she ladled stew into bowls. Alma resumed braiding, her small hands swift, her gaze darting to the window where Jasper stood watch. The fire flickered, casting long shadows that danced like specters across the walls. Outside, thunder grumbled, low and distant, but the storm wasn't in the sky. It was in the way Sonny's hand lingered on the knife she'd hidden beneath the flour sack, in the way Jasper's boots never left the floorboards near the door, in the way Nodin's cries, when they came, were soothed too quickly, as if even the child understood the weight of silence. That night, Sonny wove a new tapestry, ochre threads tangled with black, spirals that twisted inward like a storm's eye. She hung it above the hearth without explanation, but Jasper understood. It wasn't a prayer this time. It was a warning. The storm hit hard, as if the sky itself had fractured, unleashing a cacophony of thunder that roared like ghosts galloping across the heavens. Lightning split the darkness in jagged veins, illuminating the cabin's windows with fleeting bursts of silver blue light. The wind screamed through the eaves, rattling the shutters like a beast clawing to get in, while rain lashed the roof in relentless sheets, the sound a deafening drumbeat that seemed to shake the very earth. Inside, the hearth flickered, its flames dancing wildly in protest against the encroaching chill. Alma trembled, her small frame pressed against Jasper's side, her breath coming in shallow hitches that mirrored the storm's fury. He wrapped his arms around her, anchoring her to his chest, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat a counterpoint to the chaos outside. "You're safe here," he murmured, the words rough yet tender, his chin resting atop her head as he stared into the fire. Sani knelt nearby, her movements deliberate as she lit a second candle, its flame trembling, but holding against the drafts that seeped through the cracks in the walls. The light pooled in golden circles around them, casting long shadows that stretched like sentinels across the floorboards, shielding them from the storm's reach. They sat together, backs to the hearth, the warmth of the fire mingling with the scent of sage and damp wool. Alma's fingers curled around the edge of Jasper's coat, her wide eyes fixed on the candle's flame as if it were a lifeline. "Tell us something," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Jasper hesitated, the weight of memory pressing against his ribs. Then, slowly, he spun a tale of his grandfather, a man with a laugh like a freight train and a penchant for bad whiskey, trading 3 scrawny chickens and a half-empty bottle of corn mash for a mule that kicked only on Sundays. The story tumbled out in uneven fragments, his voice roughened by disuse. But as Alma's laughter bubbled up, sharp and bright, the tension in the room softened. Sani smiled too, a soundless, soft thing that lingered at the corners of her mouth, her gaze never leaving Jasper's face. The candle burned low, its wax pooling into amber droplets that hardened like tears, and Alma's eyelids grew heavy, her cheek resting against Sani's shoulder as she drifted into sleep. Sani shifted, her hand brushing a stray curl from Alma's brow before meeting Jasper's eyes. "You have the look of a man waiting to leave," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had known too many partings. Jasper's throat tightened. He stared at the fire, the flames licking at the logs with a hunger that mirrored his own restless ache. "I buried my wife 6 months ago," he began, the words scraping raw against his tongue. "I've been sleepwalking ever since. Thought grief was the only honest thing left, that it was some kind of penance." He paused, the silence between them thick with unspoken ghosts. But now, his gaze lifted to hers, steady and searching. "Now I think grief was just a hallway, and maybe I've reached the door." Sani didn't look away. Her fingers, calloused and scarred, brushed his wrist, a fleeting touch that grounded him. "And what's behind it?" she asked, her voice barely above a breath. Jasper exhaled, the sound shaky. "I don't know, but for the first time in a long while, I want to find out." Outside, the storm raged on, but within the cabin, the air felt different, charged, fragile, alive. The fire crackled, sending embers spiraling upward like tiny stars. And for a moment, the world beyond the walls ceased to exist. Sani's hand lingered on his arm, her touch warm despite the chill seeping through the cracks. Nodin stirred in his sling, his tiny fist curling against Jasper's chest, a reminder of a life that had bloomed amid the wreckage. Jasper's jaw softened, the lines etched by grief softening as he looked at her. "I don't want to run anymore," he admitted, the confession slipping free like a breath he'd been holding for too long. Sani nodded, her eyes glinting with a mix of sorrow and resolve. "Then stay," she said simply. "Not because you have to, because you choose to." The storm outside began to wane, the thunder retreating to the horizon, the rain softening to a drizzle that pattered like distant footsteps. Inside, the candles sputtered and died, leaving only the fire's glow to light the room. Alma slept soundly, her breathing slow and even, while Sani leaned her forehead against Jasper's shoulder, her exhaustion palpable. He didn't move, afraid to break the stillness, afraid to wake the fragile hope that had taken root in the space between them. For the first time in months, the silence wasn't hollow. It was full, brimming with the quiet promise of something new. And as the flames dipped and rose, casting shadows that danced like old friends, Jasper felt the weight of his wife's absence shift. Not gone, but no longer a chain around his heart. The door was open, and for once, he didn't want to walk away. Noden was born under a blood-red moon, its eerie glow seeping through the cabin's frosted windows like a warning etched in light. The air inside was thick with sweat and candle smoke, the flames flickering wildly as if stirred by the urgency of life itself. Jasper boiled water until the pot screamed, his hands trembling not from fear, but the weight of the moment. Sani sat upright on the bed, her back braced against the headboard, her knuckles white as she gripped the iron rails. She refused to lie down, her body arched against the pain, her breath shallow and sharp. The candles she'd lit cast long shadows across her face, deepening the hollows beneath her eyes, but her jaw remained set, a woman who had already faced too much to yield now. Alma slept in the barn, curled beneath a patchwork quilt with a lantern glowing softly near her head, unaware of the storm brewing both inside and beyond the cabin walls. The labor came slow at first, waves of pain rolling like distant thunder, but soon they crashed relentless, fierce enough to draw a scream from Sani's throat, a raw, primal sound that seemed to shake the rafters. Jasper crouched beside her, his hand gripping hers as though anchoring her to the earth. "Steady," he whispered, though his voice wavered. "You're doing it. You're here." She didn't answer, her gaze fixed on the window where the moon hung low and crimson, its light staining the snow outside like spilled ink. Then silence, a breathless, terrifying pause, before the cry pierced the air, thin and sharp, a newborn's voice carving its place in the world. Jasper's chest tightened as he cradled the boy, blood still slick on his arms, the warmth of him radiating like a second heartbeat. The midwife's work was done, the umbilical cord cut and tied, but he barely noticed the details. All he saw was the child, tiny, trembling, perfect, and the way something inside him cracked wide open, as if grief itself had shattered to make room for this fragile, unyielding hope. "Nodin," he whispered, the name falling from his lips like a prayer. At dawn, Alma crept in, her bare feet silent against the floorboards, the lantern's glow casting a halo around her small frame. She hesitated in the doorway, her dark eyes wide as they landed on the bundle in Jasper's arms. For a moment, she didn't move, as if testing whether this new life was real or another cruel illusion. Then she stepped forward, her fingers brushing the edge of the blanket, and whispered his name like a spell, soft, reverent, as though speaking it louder might scare him away. Sani, exhausted but radiant, reached out to tuck a stray curl behind Alma's ear. "He's yours too," she murmured, her voice hoarse but tender. Outside, the earth smelled of thawing grass and milk-warm air, the faint sweetness of firewood smoke clinging to the breeze. Spring had arrived, stubborn and insistent, but Jasper's gaze drifted to the hills, his pulse quickening. He heard it, a hoofbeat, distant and deliberate, slicing through the stillness like a blade. Rising slowly, he crossed the room, his boots thudding against the floorboards, and peered through the crack in the shutters. The hills stretched empty, their curves bathed in the pale gold of morning, but the unease coiled in his gut refused to loosen. Nothing moved, no rider, no shadow, only the wind rustling the sagebrush and the distant caw of a crow. Yet he knew, the past was coming, its footprints already softening in the mud. He checked a rifle by the door, its weight familiar, its barrel cold. Nodin stirred in his sling, his tiny fist curling against his chest, and Jasper exhaled, slow and steady. The cabin was quiet again, the fire crackling, Alma humming a lullaby as she traced her brother's fingers. But Jasper didn't sit. He stood watch, his mind already mapping escape routes, calculating distances, rehearsing the words he'd say if danger arrived. For now, the world outside held its breath. The blood-red moon had faded, swallowed by daylight, and the scent of lavender soap lingered faintly in the air, a ghost of the life he'd buried 6 months ago. But as Jasper looked at Sani, her head bent over the baby, her lips brushing Alma's forehead. He felt the truth settle deep in his bones. This was no longer just survival. This was something worth fighting for. And when the past came knocking, as he knew it would, he would be ready. They prepared without panic, but with the quiet urgency of those who understood that survival was a craft honed in silence. The air hung thick with the scent of damp earth and sage, the land itself holding its breath as Jasper moved methodically through the tasks etched into his bones. He reinforced the barn's splintered walls with fresh timber, his axe biting into wood that groaned like a living thing. The traps he laid along the perimeter were not born of desperation, but of memory. Each snare a lesson learned from Winter's spent tracking game, each hidden blade a whisper of the violence he'd hoped never to face again. Shells gleamed under his hands as he polished them, the metallic glint catching the pale light of dawn, their weight familiar yet foreign, like relics of a past Circalava tried to bury. Inside, Sani packed herbs into small bundles, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who had long known the language of healing and loss. She folded cloth diapers into tight squares, tucked dried roots into leather pouches, and wrapped vials of tinctures in oilskin, her expression unreadable. Alma climbed the barn ladder again and again, her small hands gripping the rungs until her knuckles whitened, her eyes scanning the horizon for escape routes she prayed she'd never need. She didn't speak, but her movements were sharp, deliberate, a child who had learned that survival was not a gift, but a skill. At dawn, the riders came. 3 silhouettes crested the ridge, their outlines stark against the blood-orange sky. 2 rode with the swagger of men who had never known fear, rough coats flapping like broken wings, spurs jingling like funeral bells. The third hung back, his posture coiled, cautious, a man who had seen too many graves to mistake arrogance for strength. The lead rider's vest bore the emblem Jasper had feared, a snake stitched in black thread, its fangs bared in a grin that seemed to writhe with malice. Jasper stood in the yard, rifle slung over his shoulder, the weight of it anchoring him to the earth. His boots sank slightly into the thawing mud, the ground softening beneath the weight of spring. "Nice piece of land," the leader sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Not for sale," Jasper replied, the words flat, final. The shot that followed cracked the air like lightning, splitting the moment into before and after. Chaos erupted. Horses reared, men shouted, bullets whistled through the stillness. One rider fell, clutching his shoulder, his mount bolting into the trees. Another stumbled into a trap, his legs snapping in the snare with a sickening crunch. The third turned and fled, his silhouette shrinking against the horizon until he vanished like a ghost. By midday, the bodies lay near the field, their graves marked with rough stones. Jasper's hands trembled as he shoveled dirt, the blade biting into soil that seemed to resist the intrusion. Alma placed wildflowers on each grave, a gesture too tender for the man who had come to kill them, but necessary all the same. Sani watched her daughter, her hand resting on Nodin's back as he slept in a sling against her chest. The baby stirred once, his tiny fist curling around her finger, a reminder that life persisted even in the shadow of death. That night, as the fire crackled low and the stars blinked into existence, Sani leaned her forehead against Jasper's, her breath warm against his skin. "Stay," she whispered, the word fragile yet fierce. "I already have," he replied, his thumb brushing her cheek. The wind outside carried no frost, no smoke, only the cool sweetness of grass and blooming sage. The land exhaled, as if the violence had been a knot finally undone. Inside, Nodin slept deeply, his breath a soft rhythm against the silence. Alma drew stories in chalk on the cabin floor. Horses with wings, rivers that sang lullabies, a tree that dreamed of flying. Sani danced when she thought no one watched, her movements fluid and ancient, a language older than words. Jasper smiled, the expression unfamiliar yet genuine, his calloused hands resting on the rifle now mounted by the door. The storm had passed, but the scars lingered, the ache in his shoulders, the hollow in Sonny's gaze, the way Alma still flinched at sudden noises. Yet in the quiet aftermath, love grew, stubborn and wild, even from ash. They had built something here, not out of promises, but out of shared breath, shared grief, shared defiance. And as the firelight flickered across their faces, they understood that forever was not a destination, but 1,000 small choices to stay, to hope, to hold one another as the world turned.